You've got viscosity changes, gas-oil ratio changes. You really need a reservoir simulator to account for all of that stuff. So I rarely give anybody an oil forecast much past a couple of months just because of those potential issues there. All right, so this is it with the calculated skin showing, maybe 45 barrels a day declining to, 30 barrels a day over the year. Still a pretty good looking well that they walked away from. That's with the existing skin. Now, on the other hand, if I take the skin off of it, we acidize the thing and remove any of that skin damage, it shows that I can sustain 100 barrels a day for about 3.5 months before it starts declining. At 12 months, I'm at 60 barrels a day. So it looks to me like these guys walked away from a 100 barrel a day well. And indeed, that's the case. The guy that had me look at it for him went in, completed it, and it wound up, I think cumulative production on this well is about 80,000 barrels right now in a well that was a dry hole at one time. And it's
initial recovery.
What's that?
Initial recovery on it?
The
fluid recovery?
Fluid recovery, I don't know how many feet, but it was about 40 barrels a day, 45 barrels a day.
I mean, on the DST, fluid recovery on the DST.
Yeah, I don't know how many feet it was, but it calculated that to be about 45 barrels a day.
Is this Beecham Field?
What?
Is this around the Beecham Field on the county line? Is this around the Beecham Field?
It's out in that area. Yeah, it's Dan Reynolds. I think it's a white well. So, like I say, he likes me. This is the Schlumberger Amoco DS time recommendation chart that's been around for a long time. I'm not going to go through this in detail with you. I think it's fairly self-explanatory, but it just tells you how to supervise the DST if you're out there on the location.
Yeah, I just want to get, we were talking about super pressure before. You saw that one example, and you said you don't believe in supercharge anyway.
Mm-hmm.
So how does that affect all this now? I mean, if there is no supercharge, then...
Well, like Paul said, in the classroom, you just run the tool down, set it, and take a pressure. But in the oil field, things don't work like they do in the classroom. So you get a little bit of flow out of it to make sure it's not plugging, to make sure that you really are looking at the formation as opposed to just a bunch of residual hydrostatic.
So the difference in 3 minutes or 15 minutes is significant.
Oh, it's significant. Absolutely.
To like 5 pounds, 10 pounds, 100 pounds?
It depends on the well. You can't generalize. I mean, I could run a simulation. Actually, if we have time, I can do that just to show you how much difference it makes. But why run it for 15 minutes?
Well, because it is the oil field. Sometimes you can't get people rounded up quick enough to make a decision, or somebody doesn't.
But what decision has to be made on the initial?
Just tell them, open it for 3 minutes, make sure it's flowing.
You see, that's the decision that's made before you show up on the rig, though. The decision has to be made during the final flow period and the final shutdown. The initial, you'd never run it more than 3 minutes. There's just no point in it. Okay. Most common problems. I think we beat that dog to death, and that guy goes right along with it. There again, this is not Bill Johnson. This is Schlumberger. This is Halliburton. This is everybody else in the world. These are not my recommendations. There's no original material in here. I'm just regurgitating, what has been proven in the entire rest of the world except Kansas. Okay, so we're through with DSTs for a while, and let's move on to pseudo steady state test. I love these big words. That's gawking for extended test. And GOC is an acronym I coined for geophysicists in particular. That's called, it's guardian of the knowledge. Anytime you ask a geophysicist a question, how come the red dot, was low instead of high? They start talking about all this stuff. And so us reservoir engineers, we have to have a few of these out there too. So superposition, pseudo steady state, et cetera, et cetera. But it's basically an extended test. With it, you get everything in a short-term test, plus you can often define the reservoir limits, and you can define the long-term production performance. All right, test design. I can't tell you how many tests, long-term tests I've looked at. Somebody will call me up and say, hey, we ran a long-term test, we want you to evaluate it. And I said, well, you already ran it? And they go, yeah. I said, well, what were your design parameters? And they go, well, what do you mean? And I go, well, what were you trying to accomplish with this test? Well, we need a long-term test. I go, okay. And, you know, how long did you flow it? Well, this long. And what'd you base that on? Well, this long-term test. You know, no clue. So let's talk about what goes into a well test design. What's the primary purpose of the test? Are you trying to justify a completion? Are you trying to size a pipeline or a compressor? Are you looking for boundaries? You know, perm barriers? Or are you just trying to see what the edges of the reservoir are? A properly designed test has to take these into account. So let's say that you're trying to justify a completion. You got to know how much, what's it going to cost to lay the pipe, get yourself hooked up, meters and everything. What's the gas price? How much gas, based on the gas price, and how much it's going to cost, how much gas is going to be needed to pay out the completion, and what sort of return do you want to get on it? Okay, so let's do an example here. You got completion and hookup cost of $150,000. You've got gas price net to the wellhead, you know, this is what's going to show up on your purchaser statement, $3 an MCF. The risk factor, I throw 2 in here. You're not going to complete a well just to trade dollars and get your money back. You've got to get some kind of return. Maybe it's 2, maybe it's 3, maybe it's 10. Okay, so the recoverable gas in place. In order for you to want to do this, spend this money, you're going to need the costs divided by the gas price times the risk factor. So you got $150,000 divided by $3 an MCF times a risk factor of 2 means you're going to need at least 100 million cubic feet of gas in place to pay for this and get you a return. Okay, so how do you prove up this much gas? This is what you're going to, you don't want to necessarily prove up anything more than this. It's just going to be excess profit for you. And to prove up any more than that is going to cost you money. The reason it's going to cost you money is you have to produce gas during the test. So how much gas are you going to produce during the test? Well, you take the recoverable gas in place, there, times the accuracy of the gauge. So we got 100 million cubic feet, and Paul will argue with me on this. I use 0.5% accuracy. I think the manufacturer tells you that it's a whole lot more accurate than that, but as a safety factor, I assume it's 0.5% accuracy. And the reason that comes into account is because what you're actually measuring is a pressure drop. You got to know what your initial pressure is. Let's say it's 1,000 psi, and you're going to produce this thing. And if you've got 100 million in place, you want to produce enough gas out of it so that the gauge reading, when you pull it out, is going to be meaningful. So, for instance, if you have a 0.5% accuracy on the gauge, 1,000 psi, that means that the gauge is accurate to 5 psi. So if you only take enough gas out to lower the pressure by 2 psi, that's not within the accuracy of the gauge. You won't know if you've really taken that amount out or not. So you need to take out at least 5 psi from the reservoir in order to get a meaningful number. So that says that you need to produce 500 MCF during the test in order to prove up that much gas. All right. For you math whizzes out there, constant rates provide for the best interpretation, but adjustments are typically made to account for changes in rates. We can adjust for that, but ideally, flat rate is best. All right. Remember that you are proving up a minimum amount of reserves only. You're not proving up the entire reservoir. We're only proving up this amount. If we want to prove up 10 times this amount to prove up the BCF, we're going to have to produce 10 times this amount in order to do it.